Oh my god, that is messed up. I feel like that's the reason Disney is so keen to bury the cartoons that they made during the World Wars because a lot of them have not aged very well. You take stuff like that out of context. And oh man, uh, that's awful. Anyway, how do you do, folks? And welcome to another installment of Industry Influences, a series where I take a look at something that has influenced the video game industry moving forward. And today, we've got ourselves an interesting topic that I really hope people don't find in poor taste on my part, because today we are looking at the influence of the World Wars on the gaming industry. So, for those of you who skipped your elementary school history class, the World Wars was a time period of conflict where basically everyone in the entire world was fighting. At the turn of the century, tensions were really growing in Europe with the rise of the Industrial Revolution as well as immense advances in weapons technology. Uh, Countries were stockpiling military armaments at an alarming rate, as well as forming alliances amongst themselves to prepare for an oncoming battle that no one was really sure of how it would turn out. Europe very quickly became a giant powder keg, and all it would take to set off this keg would be one spark of conflict. And that spark of conflict would one day come with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Two countries went to war, their allies joined them, then their allies got in on it, and before long, the world had been dragged into the single biggest conflict anyone had ever seen. At the time, it was referred to as the Great War, and though the conflict would end in 1918 after starting in 1914, due to the Treaty of Versailles, which demanded immense reparations from Germany, who was attributed to starting the war in the first place. It led to economic devastation that would allow Adolf Hitler to rise to power, who would again begin a campaign to take over Europe, which led to the start of a Second World War, which is why today we have World War One and World War Two. That's what we refer to the two global wars as. The World Wars were the biggest war that the world had ever seen, and World War Two is still the single deadliest war that has ever taken place over the course of humanity. And for though everything that happened during the war was awful, it's really surprising what a major effect that it had. Outside of the fact that the outcome of the war really changed the power structure within the world, it really changed the people who managed to survive it. A lot of the storytellers who managed to survive the war would take their experiences and they would sort of apply that into whatever artwork they were working on at the time. I think the most famous example of this would probably be J.R.R. Tolkien, who has stated that a lot of what he wrote in the Lord of the Rings series was inspired by his experiences in the First World War, where he served as a soldier. And what I've always appreciated about that is, despite the fact that that connection makes sense when someone tells you about it, it's not something that you immediately go to when you watch or read Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, in and of itself, actually does function very well on its own. But when you actually do look at it and think about everything that happened in World War II and World War One and all the similarities between it, yeah, it does make sense. And Lord of the Rings, of course, would go on to become one of the most influential stories in any work of media, period. It inspired all kinds of modern stories like Star Wars, the Marvel Universe, Harry Potter, and really just any high fantasy story in general. And of course, it would have a pretty big impact on video games too. The obvious comparison being The Legend of Zelda, which today is considered one of the biggest gaming franchises of all time. However, that might be a little too far removed from what people think of when they think of stuff that's inspired by the World Wars. And for that, I'd rather talk about some stuff that more closely resembles it. The first thing I want to bring attention to is really the pop culture of the time, you know, directly after the World Wars, when the soldiers started coming home. And when the soldiers came home in America, they were met with basically a hero's welcome. In the minds of the kids who watched their fathers go out off to war, their fathers came back to a hero's welcome. They were basically the superheroes that they had read about in their comic books at the time. And because of that, toy companies and all that stuff started banking on the soldiers, which is why you had stuff like the Little Green Army Men, board games based off of famous battles in the World Wars, and of course, G.I. Joe. Kids, they just thought it was cool. They wanted to be like their fathers who served in the war and defeated great evil. And of course, that influence would carry into Hollywood too, because there were a lot of movies coming out in the 60s that were inspired by the World Wars, or more importantly, directly told stories of what actually happened. One of the more famous films, probably the most famous film based off the World Wars, though, would probably have to be 1963's The Great Escape. Outside of the fact that it was one of the big mega movies of its time, with its ensemble cast, elaborate sets, and epic stunts, it would also go on to become one of the most influential films in history. There are tons of films that reference The Great Escape, and even some films that directly pay homage to it. But that impact can definitely be seen in video games too, because a lot of video games have also taken influence from The Great Escape. Take, for example, Castle Wolfenstein in 1981. It tells a similar story to The Great Escape. In the game, you take the role of a soldier who has been captured by the Nazis and taken to the inescapable Castle Wolfenstein, and the game basically sees you trying to escape. Though, looking at this gameplay footage here, you might think it's primitive, and yes, it is, but it's actually more intricate than you would think. For starters, it's not a shooty bang bang type of game. This is actually a stealth game, believe it or not. The idea here is to get out without being seen as much as possible. You have limited resources to work with. You can actually hold guards up. You can disguise yourself. For such an old game, it is impressive what they were able to pull off here. And unfortunately, Castle Wolfenstein's influence on the industry tends to be understated, mostly because in regards to the genre that it helped pioneer, another game would come along and eventually steal its thunder, and that game would also be inspired by The Great Escape, and that was the original Metal Gear. How Metal Gear came about was Hideo Kojima, who was struggling at Konami at the time, was given a project by his bosses, which was just to create an action game for the MSX based on war. Essentially, they just wanted him to make Contra, which was a very simple and very popular game for the time. Unfortunately, Kojima realized pretty quickly that Contra wasn't going to work too well for the MSX. The MSX could only render 3 or 4 character sprites on screen at once, and it wasn't capable of scrolling either, so that fast-paced and immense enemy count that made Contra so much fun to play just wasn't possible on the thing. So Kojima started looking for a different idea that he could build around the hardware of the MSX, and being the big film fan that he was, he found his inspiration when he caught a screening of The Great Escape. And that's where he got the idea for Metal Gear, which was initially just about running away from enemies as opposed to fighting them, and that would eventually evolve into trying to get by enemies without being detected. It was a revolutionary idea for the time, and though the bosses at Konami were concerned that it wouldn't do too well, Metal Gear would end up doing extremely well. It would eventually be ported to the NES, where it did gangbusters. and today Metal Gear is one of the most revered franchises in the video game industry. And I really wanted to highlight the fact that, the influence of World War One, the World Wars in general, would inadvertently lead to the creation of the stealth genre, which typically discourages violence. Now, that's not to say that in a lot of stealth games that, you can't kill your enemies. I mean, a lot of time you don't have a choice. But with games like Metal Gear, a lot of people really look for stealth games where you can play the game without getting by, without killing anyone. And that's part of the challenge of it. So, yeah, even though World War One, the World Wars, was a pretty hellish time, it's nice to think that it did inspire some ideas in the pop culture that do favor non-violence as opposed to all-out combat, which is funny because that's what people originally wanted out of Metal Gear. But, as I said, Metal Gear sort of stole Wolfenstein's thunder when it hit the scene. But another game in the series would come out that would be as influential, if not more so, than Metal Gear, and that would be Wolfenstein 3D by id Tech Software, which many say is the first-person shooter ever created. It's not, for the record. That's Catacombs 3D, and even that's debatable. But it was the first game to really create what people think of when they hear the term first-person shooter. The first-person perspective, seeing your character holding the gun, and all that stuff. And a lot of its gameplay structure and everything would carry over into its second game, next game, which would be Doom, which would essentially perfect the first-person shooter for the next couple of years. A lot of people would actually refer to games like Doom at the time as Doom clones as opposed to first-person shooters. Now, that's not to say that there weren't negative repercussions of Wolfenstein. At the time, people found the violence to be very disturbing. It was one thing to see a character shoot an enemy in Contra and just have them fall over, but in Wolfenstein, not only were you looking down the barrel of the gun as you fired at an enemy, but when you fired, they would actually crumple to the ground in a bloody mess. And that's to speak nothing of the Nazi imagery, which is going to elicit a different reaction depending on what part of the world you're in. In Germany, I think Wolfenstein is actually banned because any reference to the Nazi party is forbidden over there, and for good reason. And even here in the States, there are plenty of versions of Wolfenstein that are censored. The Super Nintendo version, for example, all the Nazi imagery has been removed, and even the dogs that come at you in the game were replaced with rats. So a lot of people might think that that's why for Doom they chose to go in a different direction rather than do a straight-up sequel to Wolfenstein. But the main reason they did that was because id Software just didn't really have an interest in doing a sequel to Wolfenstein. They want to keep mixing it up, which is why Doom went for a sci-fi setting instead. Though, it weirdly enough also had a similar backlash in regards to its violence, which I always found really silly because in Doom you're fighting the forces of hell. What's wrong with shooting those guys? And that's also kind of how I feel about the violence in Wolfenstein 3D as well. Part of the reason Nazis are such a popular enemy in first-person shooters is because when you shoot them, you don't really feel bad. I mean, these are members of the most evil organization that the world has ever seen. You don't really feel bad if something bad happens to them. But that sensitivity to depicting the violence of the World Wars is probably why you didn't see too many games trying to realistically depict it back in those days. Though there were games that definitely took influence from the World Wars, such as 1943 here, most of them were very loosely based on the World Wars, just sort of adopting some of the iconography and technology of the time. It's kind of like how in Top Gun, to avoid any real-world parallels, they don't actively name the country that the characters are up against in that film. However, towards the end of the 90s, a film came out that sort of changed perceptions of the World Wars, and that was Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. Uh, at the time, it was praised for its less romanticized depiction of World War II in favor of a darker, grittier, violent depiction of the war that was very shocking to audiences at the time. But a lot of people really took to it because, they had never seen something like this. They had never seen World War II depicted in this manner. And because of that, it became one of the biggest films in history. As Steven Spielberg was making the film, however, he would be introduced to another game, and that would be GoldenEye from the Nintendo 64. He was blown away by the technology on display in that game, and he wondered if it would be possible to combine the gameplay of that game with the realism that he was depicting in Saving Private Ryan. So he got a team together after wrapping up filming and began work on his vision for this video game. However, it came at a really bad time in the industry. The Columbine shootings had just occurred, so violent content in media was all of a sudden under more scrutiny than it had ever been before. And in addition to that, a lot of people didn't like the idea of taking something as dark and violent as the World Wars and turn it into a video game, because this was still around the time when the perception of video games was that they were, stuff for kids. But, and it even got to, even the Medal of Honor Society, a group of veterans, were hell-bent on making sure that the game didn't come out. Spielberg was even considering canceling the game because of the backlash it was getting. However, the team behind the game really believed in what they were making and actually brought members of the Medal of Honor Society to the studio to see what they were working on, because they wanted to show them that what they were making was tasteful, it was respectful, and they weren't just turning World War I into a violent shooter. And that they were very successful in that too, because that's exactly what the Medal of Honor Society thought. So they would actually endorse the game. So Steven Spielberg's game would end up becoming Medal of Honor, which in a lot of ways is the first true military FPS that ever came out. Medal of Honor was praised for the time for its realism, its depiction of World War II, and it would do gangbusters at retail. It's still one of the most popular games ever released for the PlayStation. And it would lead to the start of a long-running series as well. By the time Medal of Honor Frontline had come out, technology had actually progressed to the point where developers could actually depict the big, large-scale battles that that Spielberg originally depicted in Saving Private Ryan. For example, you have the famous Omaha Beach scene basically being recreated here, which was really impressive for the time. However, a couple of programmers working on the Medal of Honor series felt that Medal of Honor was sort of limiting itself in a lot of regards. They felt that it focused too much on the American side of things, and because of that, you weren't really getting the full global scale that the World Wars were in the grand scheme of things. So they broke off and they would make a new game called Call of Duty, which didn't do anything that differently from Medal of Honor, all things considered, outside of the fact that it depicted other countries participating in the World Wars. So in addition to an American campaign, you also had a British campaign and a Russian campaign, and some of the scenes in this game were incredibly shocking for the time and depicting some pretty big battles that happened during the war. I think the most famous level in the original Call of Duty is the Stalingrad level, which sees you participate in the infamous suicide charge, where due to a surplus of infantry and limited resources, the Russian army equipped their men with either a rifle or a stripper clip of bullets, and basically had them rush the opposition. The idea being that once one man fell, the other guy would grab what they didn't have and continue fighting, which is really screwed up to imagine. It must have been terrifying for those men to face. That's not to say anything of Omaha Beats. I would have been What am I saying? The entire World Wars were terrifying, but I feel like that's part of why these games are beneficial in existing. While it's one thing to see the stuff depicted in a movie or listen to some monotone teacher read about in school, actually getting to play a game like this that so realistically depicts these battles and actually getting to participate in it, it really gives you a sense of what everyone who participated in the World Wars had to go through. Just the horrifying odds that they were up against and the despicable situations that they were often put in. So, yeah, I feel like there was a lot of value in these realistic shooters of World War II. However, there was one thing about Call of Duty that I didn't like, and that's primarily the fact that another big thing that they focused on was the multiplayer in the game. Call of Duty was a very popular shooter back in its day, and while I didn't really mind the violence in something like Wolfenstein, that was because you were shooting at NPCs who were Nazis. But in the multiplayer mode of Call of Duty, you know, you're fighting other people, playing as other soldiers, and yeah, that just doesn't sit right with me. But a lot of people might call that a double standard, but that's just a personal feeling I have. I'm just not a big fan of, you know, realistic multiplayer shooters. There's just something about it that bothers me. Regardless of my personal feelings, Call of Duty would be a huge hit, and after it came out, there was a sudden rush of military shooters that would depict the World Wars. It unfortunately got to the point where the market started to flood, actually, and Infinity Ward, the guys who came up with Call of Duty, saw that coming, and for their next game, wanted to move the action out of the World Wars and into the modern day. Something that Activision was firmly against, while every successive Call of Duty game and even the Medal of Honor games were selling significantly less and less as the years went by. They were still posting good numbers, and they felt that changing it up so quickly would be too much, that people wouldn't want to play the series anymore. So much so that they shirked a promise that they had made to Infinity Ward, where Infinity Ward would work on the number games while Activision put out the spin-offs. Immediately after Infinity Ward told Activision that they wanted to do a game that took place in the modern day, they broke that promise, put out Call of Duty 3, and as Infinity Ward worked on what would become Modern Warfare, they also put out Call of Duty World at War, so, you know, they could save face in the event that Modern Warfare didn't do too well. Unfortunately, Modern Warfare would do extremely well, and after it came out, the taste of military shooters suddenly changed. World War II shooters were suddenly out, and now the games were depicting a modern day. This is honestly where my interest in the Call of Duty series sort of ended. Part of the appeal of the original Call of Duty games was actually getting to see these large-scale battles depicted in a manner where you could actually, you know, interact with it. But now it's all completely fictionalized and often just took the form of a crappy Michael Bay film, especially as the games went on. So, yeah, Call of Duty, while I wouldn't say Modern Warfare ruined the series, I mean, I'm not even sure which game ruined the series now that I think about it. But Call of Duty 4 is definitely where things shifted and Call of Duty became something else entirely. And though Medal of Honor would stick to the World War II shooting for a while, eventually it too would enter the modern day with some pretty negative results. But today, military shooters are still big bucks, but they've really just sort of become a yearly franchise, kind of like Madden or NBA. It's just something that people expect to come out, and people don't really get excited for it like they used to. Now, it's not to say that it was the end of the World Wars in video gaming. I think it was 2016. wanting to shake things up, EA would actually put out Battlefield 1, Battlefield being their own military shooter, which depicted World War One. It was something fresh and new for the time in a genre that had become very uniform, and it posted some of the best numbers that the series had seen in a while. So the next couple of games in the series would actually depict the World Wars again, and Call of Duty would follow suit as well with Call of Duty World War. But it wouldn't be long before people got tired of this too, and they eventually went back to, you know, the modern military shooters or futuristic shooters in some cases. That's what they tried to do, and I don't think that's really worked out for them. But yeah, as you can see, the events of the World War have had a really big impact on the gaming industry. It's influenced tons of games, and I'm only scratching the surface here. And while I do feel there are some ethical concerns regarding depicting such a major historical event, such a bloody historical event as well, I do feel like there is some benefit to that too. I mean, some of the stuff that World War One, World War Two inspired actually does lead to some ideas that aren't necessarily violent, as is the case with a stealth game. And, you know, again, being able to actually take part in these large-scale battles and actually get a sense of what these men and women went through in order to make sure that the world was still there when it was time for the next generation to take over, you know, it really does feel like something special. Now, that's not to say that it can't be cheapened or that it can't be disrespectful, but, you know, it's just another good way to really remember the men and women who laid down their lives to just try and make the world a better place when all this was happening. So, yeah, that's World War II's, World War I's, the World War's impact on the gaming industry. I hope you guys enjoyed this installment of industry influences, and hopefully next time I have something that isn't going to be as touchy. I'm really hoping I'm not offending anyone with this video, but if I am, please say so in the comments, and if it is, I apologize for it completely. But anyway, that's the story, and I'll see you guys next time.